All right, today we're going to talk about orbital satellites and we're going to apply a surface on these satellites. It's going to be a uniform processor. So this surface has the ability using gear set logic to convert a certain frequency into a torque moment of field couple. So by field coupling over a distributed surface in phase lock an array such that that volume is taken into account in a point out logic of the surface coupling, you get the Templar or the survey grid logic of imagining how uh, you can use the fulcrum effect to imbue the right amount of dimensions into this space is appropriate to logically explain it. That's a points out array where every needed integer, well, all you need is the integers, right? Because then it's, point out from a fulcrum moment, the total number is the amount of dimensions of logic stored, and each point the address of what it's taken into account. Anyways, that's too deep into it. What we wanted to talk about, I'm sorry. What we wanted to talk about is if something is in a orbital path on the surface of the planet, for example, uh, we want to be able to capture let's think about the total amount of thermal effect on the body of the satellite. In effect, what's the average temperature of the satellite? And what sources are there for that temperature? And in this context, there's mostly the solar. Sometimes there might be some lunar reflection. We want to take in account, though, is that we have this uniform processor that can uh, maybe like gluons themselves, capture frequency effects through the integer of semiconduction. And using semiconduction and the properties of wave characteristics with the cosmic time delay, we can start looking for the characteristic wave pattern and then start looking for, since we know the distance away of the source, what we would expect to see. So we can have the system very much ready for that tangent energy to be a, very solid point inspirational logic of torque energy applied to a point. And so by having that distribution just right, then we can, basically use that as a logic on how we slow down photons to basically the zero intercept and then have this sickle of frickin' energy just ready, for a multitude of things, right? Because if you have that nested layer and you're inherently trying to pump then a characteristic amount of energy into it, then that explanation, that ticker tape of derivations, you can then have, fold back into itself, almost like anodizing aluminum, where the surface deformation of, the characteristics of thermals in the area or radiation that's inherently getting through in the system has that feedback mechanism where it's either shrinking back in on itself or it's dissipating due to the criticality of the system. And at this point we're talking about a zero velocity system of bosonic emissions. It's bosonic because characteristically this is a very strained and thorough field. Thorough in the sense of how much of the space-time it's absorbed in a wave smooth surface charge of the field energy it wove into it. So it's a very detailed replica of what it's captured thus far, because temporally it's locked to distance. And so that ends up being something to think about, is what kind of changes could be expected on that surface, and what does that mean to, the amount of energy, the dissipations themselves. Well, keep track of it. And so if you keep track of that, that's when it goes from a BEC, a Bose-Einstein condensate, to an A or a aqua Bose-Einstein condensate, because you've kept track of the bubble of emissions. So it's going back through your uniform processor. You're just basically seeing like the edge physics state. And if you have the right tracking system, you have a light lag of clusters, maybe of distance, I suppose, of flux, whatever the right characteristic term is for that description in your indices of managing that, then you've got the characteristic wherewithal to, have a very good plan of use for that. And so you could consider that like a inherent anti-particle of energy if you need to, on how you can utilize that in systems. And then it's really characteristic of how you make the craft, I suppose, on how that might be unilaterally woven into the rigging of the vessel itself. And so I've been thinking of spherical vessels just because it's kind of a simplified system. You just put all the absorption material, like the solar panels in essence, on one side, the sun side. Yet these uniform processors can actually dynamically change, either by just structurally moving like an electroactive polymer distribution of, assisted components in that matrice could compel the material to, squeeze or constrict, and thus creating a kind of a wave of absorption. So that might be a better surface gradient for absorbing a much wider range. I think I saw somewhere that if solar was absorbing some 10 to 15, that this might have the wherewithal to imagine it like the 30th percent range. If you're using the three different, I think we're including the particular quantum dots to get the infrared part of the spectrum, while we're getting the visible part of the spectrum. I think that was what CEZ, I want to say, maybe that quantum dot. It's the classic one that we use in monitors. Then there's the PB. I actually want to get them right, so I'll go and check the website. Uh, I'm such a copy paste individual that I have so little gravitas for, trivia, and I feel like right now I'm mostly just interlinkage on math principles. No, maybe just engineering principles. Fulcrums, pivots, wave effects for absorption. It's amazing to think that we have the distributed surface, shapes on the planet for these different antennas. And while that antenna sits there, you don't know it, but someone else could characteristically be using a phase lock wave of it to then inherently use a rotational energy. If they had that kind of timing, then that wouldn't leave any trace. It would just be standard noise within the system. So it's like there's so many cross utilities with the atmosphere and the environment that's currently around, that ends up being fascinating utilities for, weaving a distributed uh, holographic and local storage media of what's been seen. So like imagine how this is supposed to be a scalar process, where what I'm thinking is, in rotational energy of the molecule, if a tick of the right strata of that energy was to capture, say, I don't even know, some 10% of what photonic energy might have been available. And during that process, that rotational kinetics capture that energy at the right time to where that discrete set of ticks were phase locked to couple into the locality of that, local map. Then the processors themselves in distribution to one another, one vessel approaching another vessel, could undergo a wave transform for a quantity of those Bose or the A-Beck pools, because it could go ahead and maybe leech off a small subset of it, a traded value, because this is an entire phase matched strata of the other pool. And so I think that in the decoupling process and in the inherently in the wave matching process, these small spherical, what would you call it? Transforms of the wave photonic logic that's all nested inside this stuff, uh, is those are it would be a smoothing effect to where it currently resides. And so then when that's brought to one vessel or the other, or maybe exchanged, then the updates to each of those maps could be amplified through the vessels themselves into the right ratio for an even distribution into that massive map of energy that it might have available. And so then if there's these emergency situations and suddenly it looks like the smack the frickin' mic. It suddenly looks like the sun might have some kind of I don't even know, a solar flare. And this is far out. I don't know if this part's real. So far, logically, what we've talked about before is real and possible, because the real key there, and I'll go ahead and re-say it. I've said it 1,000 times and I'll say it again. We got to make sure that we have the not only the strata matched, the processors themselves. You have this flat chip, and for the most part, it's a insulated noise to wave characteristic where we're using frequencies, and we see within the subset enough of a signal and how much those echoes delay to where we can trust the compute with these surface calculus. But what we should be starting to think about with this massive capacity of AI is how we can fine tune the system such that it sends out waves cohesively throughout the structure of the system. And those waves, yeah, characteristically, they'll either slow down because of the amount of EM it takes to reweave through that particular strata, or might be insulated from getting through it, and thus it has the uniform bladder effects of capacitance. But that's inherently a benefit in how these can be updated, such that while we have that uniform wavefront of energy, the pivotal torque to the reality around us becomes what we're enabling, because we're not used to thinking about it. We're used to thinking about the noise. Just, sucks. We just create all this heat out here in the local environment. But then you start studying those the thermal couple, where you have a surface on a vessel, and the energy through it, if there's a temperature delta between the two surfaces, there's an actual amount of energy that can be garnered from that. That was a very insightful phenomenon, and that nuance of detail is what leads me to think that by weaving that couple through the strata of volumes correctly, in effect, is our cross cancel to wave noise in the stress strain of space-time. That's really difficult to appreciate, because it requires thinking of every single point in this total characteristic of either it's going to be a full-on electronic phase of change, or it's going to be a full-on magnetic change. But to imagine it's also a phase effect of one another. You have to have that entire orbital set stay true to rotational pivotal energies, and know that, yeah, that's why there's the shadowing effect of EM going from one field to the other. Not exactly a characteristic. You can't oversimplify it. I know I sound like I'm oversimplifying it, but I'm not, because in the universal processor, the mem gear set is those alignments such that it becomes a actual mechanical hand torque apparatus that creates a Mobius strip of this phase lock battery that does react. It's a freaking reactive thing, but yet you have to, if you have the volume around it mapped, if you know that much of the field effect around, then you can at least, control that freaking clown balloon of IT complication into something real useful. And so you think of it of a clown balloon where the atmosphere itself can leach through the walls of the balloon. So you need to devise a tracking method, a protocol for that kind of emission effect, which is, if it, I guess maybe the right term is if it shorts out in the environment like a Kepler switch, then you have a gravitational wave effect somewhere where you either lost a subset of the BEC in that radio wave that actually did manage to dissipate out in an inherently through the field effect. Um, and if you know, then maybe you just update the processor to backfill that right amount of data back in to where you have a patching mechanism. And I think that the right term isn't to think that we're trying to make the entire apparatus a big freezer. It's just by knowing of the freezing influence to when signals cross logic in space through process wires, the strata of the uniform processor, and how these logical switches get toggled by the field itself. Well, it's that part of the fielding itself that makes these modern computers so much more capable than we realize. Not only do all of the CEOs know how there's like so many updates, at least with, Windows, where a person could detune the OS, which would greatly increase how useful that computer is if they went ahead and maybe this is more or less already applied, but in emulation, all of these the equipment that we have divvied out, it's still like the Voyager craft where we can make it better. Even by creating an impedance field inside the device, we might even be able to characteristically reorganize some of the molecular strata and create energy channels, basically, either optical deltas for storing it in that energy wavefronts to those or throughout those deltas, or slowly transforming it into its own process surface area. I don't know. It's something to think about. It's something to think about because it seems like uniform processors, or at least thinking about processors in three-dimensional geometries where you're canceling the energy and you're surfing the wave of where it would be cost effective to signal a gap, or at least make that gap logic, possible in a timely manner to where it's still a computational effect, yet it just happened to be the cheapest one at that time to be able to make it there. And so by being able to surf those waves, then you get the Snellian subset of field couple, where that was super cheap, then it had that much field effect. And so that's where the board goes tangent to, the energy field around it in the right avenue of rotational to temporal linkage. And so the better we get at that, the more we can induce that into the field around us, and such that batteries become memory sets, so that becomes an entire landscape for thoroughfare traffic of molecular, influence, if the surface is, such that it can couple through it. I don't know. You think of that. I'm out.